Hello, I'm Tallulah Gray, and welcome to my new podcast, Married to the Military. Before we begin this episode, I want to provide a trigger warning for all listeners. The conversation does involve themes of domestic abuse and trauma, which may be distressing or triggering for some individuals, so listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is affected by domestic abuse, then I encourage you to seek immediate support from trusted organisations and professionals. Details of support agencies are in the podcast description. Thank you for listening. Do you think then that you could take someone that wouldn't necessarily be a perpetrator and then it comes through the military training and it can almost generate a perpetrator? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Financial abuse, and then moving on to more severe forms of disrespect, abuse, and then violence. And I was on my own and terrified and pregnant.
Married to the Military, Episode 1, featuring Roberta Leem-Bruggen, a military wife, mother, physician associate, MRes in public health, and now about to embark on PhD studies, and a domestic abuse survivor. Continue listening to hear Roberta's incredible journey and how she hopes to help other military spouses with her research.
In the simple prevalence terms, there is more domestic violence in military communities than there is in civilian communities in the UK. The research that I'm looking at is specifically looking at spousal victims of domestic violence from perpetrators who are in the military, and the risk factors that come with that as well. One spouse even reported that she would have to be locked in her house by herself and her partner for weeks at a time because she'd been so violently abused that he had disfigured her. And to keep up this perfect facade, she stayed in and only came out once the bruises had gone. That's terrifying. I studied in Bristol, and that amazingly led into a fantastic clinical career as a physician associate. Loved every single second of it. And I did not join my husband on any of his deployments or wherever he was living. We lived very much a long distance relationship and we had our lovely daughter. It was difficult juggling my almost separate single mum life with a full-time job whilst my husband was in the military. And it was hard for, obviously, my husband as well. He's away. He's not seeing us at times, not being able to message us or phone calls for weeks. And it is hard. So we needed that family unit. And it doesn't matter for me, really. Obviously, I love my academia. I love research. I love what I do. But the main thing for me is that is replaceable. My family is not. So I had to make the sacrifices there because my stubbornness really was what was holding us back from being a family. And the military has given us the ability to be a family for the first time. Prior to meeting my fantastic husband, I was with a less than fantastic man.
Oh, no.
I know, disgusting. But I became a victim of interpersonal or relational violence and abuse, financial, physical, all the types of abuse. Thankfully managed to grow from that, get out of it and grow some more. When I came into military life this time last year, I shared a story regarding abuse, which made me then go on to have a look at safeguarding policies and the welfare policy, and what is then done for victims, especially in an overseas setting. And was, I don't want to say I was shocked at what I found. I would probably say I was more so disappointed in the way in which interventions and supportive strategies are set up more so to educate those who are personnel and not directly related to those who are spouse or who could be perpetrators or victims. I'm in no way saying that personnel are the perpetrators and the spouse are the victims in every case. But the research that I'm looking at is specifically looking at spousal victims of domestic violence from perpetrators who are in the military and the risk factors that come with that as well. And it has been extremely mind-blowing and enlightening. In the simple prevalence terms, there is more domestic violence in military communities than there is in civilian communities in the UK.
And this is reported, obviously.
This is all already reported in previous literature. The latest reports coming out, even from 2023, stating that it's either staying steady or it's on an increase. There's a little bit of data debate there.
Okay, I mean reported as in reported acts of domestic abuse, or are they talking about potentially what's hidden
So
as
it's
well?
reported acts,
Right.
with research also having stated that as a result of what is available publicly, data-wise, that is likely a massive underestimate. Freedom of Information Act requests can only give you the details or the numbers of cases that are confirmed in terms of allegations or cases that have been kept secret. Those cannot be determined from a Freedom of Information Act request. So it's impossible to tell the exacting numbers, but it is more severe, more prevalent, and also more severe in terms of impact and also perpetration type in military in comparison to civilian communities.
And is that broken down into specific types of domestic abuse? So you mentioned there's the physical, there's the financial and coercive control. Is it broken down, or is it all just under the domestic abuse umbrella?
So annoyingly, the majority of research that has come out over the past 20 years, there is some UK data, but the majority is the US data. There isn't enough data looking at, in fact, there's one paper, I think, recently that came out discussing coercive control in the UK military population, but that's one paper. And to go off of one paper, which increased a heck of a lot of bias into any results that I'd be publishing. So that really needs to be heavily looked into in terms of type. I could make an assumption that it would be poor of me to do so.
Yeah, absolutely.
The risk factors that come with just general military living, even down to the fact that spouse tends to do more unpaid care work as well as unpaid work, all the way over to partners going away on deployment. The military culture's attitude towards drinking alcohol from a social perspective, the secret drug use, the training and tactics used within the military to increase violence and aggression tactics for wartime has an implication for personnel and how they behave at home. All of these factors can increase the risk of domestic violence in households. And it's terrifying to think that that's the case, when actually it needn't be that way.
So do you think then that you could take someone that wouldn't necessarily be a perpetrator and then they come through the military training and it can almost generate a perpetrator? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Again, this is from very loosely based on broad data. When looking at the areas of where persons come from, a lot of persons entering the military tend to come from lower socio-demographic backgrounds if they're entering as a soldier. And within that, there's increased risk factors anyway for being a perpetrator of domestic violence. The tactics and of obviously military capabilities, operational effectiveness, all of this, it all comes down to how effective is this person at dealing with war, and plowing them with information and knowledge on war and combat constantly. It is going to create that sort of hyper-masculinized mindset of aggression is good, the end. And that is kind of why we're seeing the increased prevalence in military communities in comparison to civilian communities.
Is there a breakdown of data between the different military branches?
Breakdown of data, annoyingly, the data pool tends to veer more towards the army side, simply because of the numbers, and usually because of the methodologies used to gather these individuals. It tends to be more army based. There has I'm trying to think. It was King's College London had conducted a study. Lane et al. And McManus et al. looking at the various branches, and off the top of my head, I don't believe there was any difference between any of the tri-services, etc., or rank, actually, which surprised me slightly, considering the socio-demographic backgrounds typically of those coming in as soldiers. But there wasn't a statistically significant difference between rank either. So I can't remember specifically, but I'm pretty certain it was pretty level across the board.
Okay. Then in terms, again, of looking at, the servant personnel as a perpetrator for the purposes of this conversation, even though you've already said it's not always that way, but just for this conversation, we know that servant personnel obviously can be male or female. So is there any data around female serving personnel who the numbers are perpetrated?
Regardless of relationship type, dynamic, domestic abuse can happen. It's as simple as that. It can, purely from the ground of my research, looking at the male perpetrator versus spouse, because of the enormity of data on that specifically.
Okay. And what specifically are you going to be studying for your PhD?
So for my study, I am looking at spousal experience and the burden of domestic violence and abuse, and how that translates into a spouse's life in the present and in the future, depending on when that occurred. Within that research, I'm hoping to build up patterns of, themes coming from the experiences and then the burdens experience, to then take forward and build supportive strategies and interventions to aid specifically the spouse, ignoring the personnel side completely, but looking at the spouse and what we can do to help them with the risk factors that come from the military. It's almost naive to say to someone who's experiencing domestic violence in a military sphere, here's a resource, a civilian resource, give them a call and have a chat. Because the minute you start going off about deployment and PTSD and this, that, the next thing, and the culture, they aren't going to have a clue. A lot of the time, there are those who are specifically trained, but unless you go to these specialized services, you're kind of stuck without the help that you deserve as a survivor of domestic violence. So that's what I'm trying to aim to build in my narrative synthesis that I have been completing. There's 5 papers that I've included, 3 from the UK and 2 from the US. So it's actually more heavily balanced in the UK, which was great for what I was looking at. And then taking forward into further research. But there was within the qualitative side, so it's looking at the actual experiences and impact of domestic violence or abuse on spouse themselves. It gives that understanding of how they feel, rather than just looking at the statistics that comes from the quantitative side. Because you can look at stats and feel like potentially I might slip into that bracket or might slip into that bracket, but not have a definitive answer for yourself. Whereas someone who's explaining how they actually feel, you can say, oh gosh, I really relate to that. So that, looking at those 5 papers, I did a thematic analysis. I looked at various themes throughout the papers and collected them into little groups. And I came up with 2 main themes and a bunch of subordinate themes. The main themes being the influence of the military on relationship dynamics, and then the impact itself. And it goes into a lot of depth in both of them. Every relationship has its ups and downs. And just because you have ups and downs in relationships, resentment, anger, it doesn't mean that that's an abusive relationship. It means you're in a relationship, because we're only human beings. When it jumps over into that abusive side, there's a lot of signs, but quite often people don't even recognize that they're in an abusive relationship. And it's more of the feelings that it causes within yourself. If you're feeling underappreciated, underrespected, down to the physical aspects of being hit, kicked, slapped, there's a huge array of behaviors within abuse and violence that can tip the scales over into it being a typical domestic abuse scenario, whether that's financial control or stopping you wearing from what you want to wear, not being able to go out with friends, being in contact with family, pushing you to have sexual intercourse when you don't want to have sex, not taking no for an answer, disrespecting you as a human being, and all the way through to things as severe as disfiguring you physically. There's a massive scale there. And I couldn't sit and go through every single different element because there's a massive, multifaceted pathway of risk factors that lead up to each of these behaviors and can incorporate so many different individual risks. But it's knowing that yourself, that if any of these behaviors that your spouse is portraying or giving to you, actually that might not be normal. And it's up to you to have a little look into that to determine whether or not you're in a safe place or whether this is something that could be bad for you as an individual. And that can take a lot of time and a lot of strength as well.
So, can we delve a bit more into the risk factors? I know you've touched on them before, specifically with the military.
Yes, absolutely. So within one of the themes of the qualitative research that I looked at, the military influence on relationship dynamics, there was a subordinate theme that looked at IPVA, or interpersonal violence and abuse, IPVA, and how that extends beyond the home. And that can be an increased tendency to alcohol, which has been shown in a number of studies with increasing alcohol misuse. PTSD from military experiences that you don't often see in civilian life. Obviously, the military experiences, you do experience PTSD. If I was to focus even just on the PTSD side, there is a lot of research into PTSD from a military perspective. And there is actually a book written by a fantastic author called Van der Kolk in 2014 called The Body Keeps Score. And the actual origins of PTSD itself comes from something that used to be called shell shock, which was a soldier-specific trauma response. And you see often kind of thoughts that a lot of people have with PTSDs, they link that specifically back to veterans. And a lot of that comes from the actual origin of where shell shock and PTSD was named. There's a lot of trauma. I'm not taking away from the fact that personnel experience horrific things and see combat and death like you wouldn't necessarily see in a civilian population. But when it comes to IPV itself, the soldier response, the soldier's shell shock response or PTSD is often used as an excuse for abusive behavior. In a court system, people have looked at the personnel perpetrator, and when PTSD has come up at the defense for their behavior, court systems can quite often see the behavior as they'll sympathize for that behavior. It's almost justifying the behavior. So seeing them not as a perpetrator, but as a military hero. But it's important to note that you can be a military hero, but you can also be a perpetrator of domestic violence. Those are two completely separate entities.
Because now you have two traumatized people. You have the military personnel, the PTSD, that has become perpetrator of domestic abuse, and now their victim, could also be experiencing trauma too.
It's very, very interesting. And there isn't research on that specifically, and it would be unwise for me to make an assumption without evidence base. Potentially. But there is overarching theme that comes through from survivors of violence and abuse, where they do feel second best and they do feel subordinate. And this whole necessity to change who they are as a person, literally leaving their life behind in some cases. I mean, I had to leave everything behind, my career, my home, my family, to move out here to Germany. I'm not a victim or survivor of domestic violence through the military, but there are some who are, and having to leave all that behind whilst going through all these experiences can make you feel so vulnerable, thus adding to even more risk factors that you have.
Absolutely. I think the other issue with military families that's massive is that their whole life is military. You're so entrenched in the lifestyle.
That was massively echoed in the papers as well, of that there was one spouse in particular in one of the UK papers saying she gave everything up and had nowhere to go. It's the pressure to be, again, by another spouse who gave her story, a good little wife within the military, and be this stoic embodiment of a military spouse rather than being yourself for fear of being judged or resented by others, despite the fact that other spouse probably feel exactly the same way as you, but you're condensed into this can of militarized family living that is actually at times quite an abnormal way to live. But to fit in, as every human being wants to do in a population, small or large, you do engage with a lot of activities and thoughts and belief patterns that your community does. And a lot of that also includes behavior patterns. But that, for a survivor or ongoing victimization in domestic violence households, can be extremely dangerous, where you're being pushed to be this perfect person at all times. But at home, it's chaos. One spouse even reported that she would have to be locked in her house by herself and her partner for weeks at a time because she'd been so violently abused that he had disfigured her. And to keep up this perfect facade, she stayed in and only came out once the bruises had gone. That's terrifying.
That is. It's also terrifying that no one knew what was going on or thought, to say, oh, we've not seen her emerge from the house for a while. Let's go and check up on her. Is everything okay? I did have a conversation with a couple of ladies the other day, so military spouses. They talked about their experience of supporting someone through a domestic abuse situation. One of the stories was particularly harrowing, and the support was offered through giving a key to her own home for a safe space and these kinds of things. And the lady I spoke to felt like if she had pushed for, action to be taken or to report it or something like that, then the outcome would have been that that woman would have turned against her, and then she would have no one to go to. Like, she would then be further isolated even more. And that's such a difficult position for anyone to have to be in, where you have to watch someone suffer, but you feel like there's no other choice because you know that they'll push you away otherwise.
It's a really interesting dynamic with that, though. It kind of echoes what is seen in research, and it shouldn't have to get to that stage. But when there appears to be no help, or there are increased barriers to help-seeking behaviors, the fear that then would come with that knowledge that someone is trying to help you, it's how is it weighed? How is it weighed for you personally in that instance? And it should never have to be, do I survive this or do I not? But it seems like it's that way in these military communities, in those instances of domestic violence. And that's shocking, actually.
It is, yeah. But I think it comes back to what we were talking last time, is that no one really knows what to do, or where to go for support, or the barriers to that come with it, so that they're going to lose their home, that they're going to lose their standing in the community, that it could affect their partner's job in the military.
Exactly. It's the age-old thing of when a perpetrator, in this instance, it can be vice versa, but when it's a personal perpetrator and the spouse, the victim, is saying, well, I don't want to upset the apple cart, I don't want to do this just in case, I want to help, I want to be that stoic, good wife, they haven't done anything to push for violence. They've not wanted their husband, partner to hit them, abuse them, manipulate them. It's not on the victim, it's on the perpetrator. The victim hasn't done anything to deserve the behaviors that are happening to them. The perpetrator is the one at fault. I think what happens in a military sphere is that this whole
the job is so important, and it is, don't get me wrong, the military is important in terms of geopolitics and protection services, everything that happens for our country to keep us safe, very important. But in terms of a domestic violence situation where there's a perpetrator, them losing their job because they are a violent human being towards the people they shouldn't be being aggressive towards, that's on them. That's not on the spouse. And the military, there needs to be less of this understanding or belief pattern that you do see repeated in the qualitative research that the military personnel partner is untouchable. If you were to take that situation and pop it into a civilian circumstance, the partner is not untouchable. It is still incredibly difficult to seek help. It is still incredibly difficult to admit to yourself that there is wrongdoing and that you need to protect yourself. Don't get me wrong. However, there is zero difference when it comes to abuse in a civilian culture and a military culture, other than the belief patterns that encapsulate and surround military families in this militarized community sphere. And I think that tends to be a sort of overarching theme of why it's so difficult to seek help in these communities.
Hello, I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far. I just wanted to take a few seconds to tell you about one of my books, The Unplannable Planner, which is a journal for military spouses to help you navigate the ups and downs of military life. With entry spaces for 365 days, a deployment countdown calendar, and essential advice on managing the challenges that military life throws at all of us, is designed to support military families through thick and thin. Plus, it does include some useful hacks for dealing with unique situations of military life that you are bound to face. And it's available now on Amazon. Just search Tallulah Gray or follow the link in the podcast description. Do the military provide a safe space for victims, or accommodation while they sort their lives out, while they're trying to escape, or some kind of refuge, or anything at all?
So being only really well versed in the community that I'm in, there is a safe house. So but it takes multiple steps to get to that point. The number one being admitting to yourself that there is actually something going on that you need to change. Secondly, having the courage to make those phone calls in the first place. As if something was going on in my household, and I'd made the decision to get help and had finally given myself the strength to just say, right, that's enough, I've had it, let's get help. My first port of call is to get in contact with welfare, and welfare then have the duty to put me into the welfare housing. I know that is available for people who are struggling in relationships for a number of different issues and a number of different reasons, but one of them is the domestic violence situation. Absolutely.
I feel like if the only option at the moment, when a military spouse has given up so much for the military lifestyle, and their only option is the kind of safe houses and women's refuges that are provided, that obviously do an amazing job, of
Yes.
course, but there has to be another option for a military spouse, because they're in a position where they've given everything up for the military lifestyle.
Of course. And I mean, there are other things that can happen within that to aid. I know that obviously the military housing side of things and the welfare house or safe house, if you have to leave there, or you're having to leave the community, for example, there is a clause, I believe it's 90 days that you can stay there without your partner being there, or if something's changing, you have to move away, you can have 90 days. That does give you sufficient time to start to set things up for yourself, whether that is benefits for yourself and your children, finding a job, getting yourself set up with your community that you're used to, that you've got some time there. The main thing within that is being able to acknowledge and remember that as a victim or survivor of IPVA or domestic violence, you're still entitled to a lot of the help, or all of the help, I should say, that civilians in the UK are entitled to as well.
Yeah. So,
And I think that's often forgotten.
so actually, I think what I'm getting from you then is that the main thing is acknowledging a problem and to not worry too much about what happens afterwards, because there are things in place and there is support in place, and there are steps that can be taken, but that all falls into place once you acknowledge the issue and start to seek help. Is that right?
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. And that is the main thing, the main barrier in all of this, whether it from a structural perspective, from a military perspective, that doesn't matter. It's about how ready are you to make that step to get out of this relationship. And that is the hardest step to do. But once you've done that, everything does fall into place.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be where I am now chatting with you if I hadn't made that decision to get out of my abusive relationship. And thank God I did.
How long did it take you to come to terms with that? That's what you needed to do.
A solid year and a half.
From when it started, or from when you realised that what was going on wasn't okay?
From when it's probably a mixture of both. I think I had the realizations of both around the same time, starting off with the financial abuse, and then moving on to more severe forms of disrespect, abuse, and then violence. It took a long time, and I was on my own and terrified and pregnant, and I had to make a decision to either commit myself to a relationship and a life of hell or leave. And I got out with some, not masses of support. A lot of the support I neglected myself, because the denial comes in and it's not that bad and it's okay and it'll get better. But it doesn't ever get better in those circumstances. To become better, the only solution is to leave and start again and find yourself and grow from that, and everything worked out.
I can't imagine how hard that must have been.
It was hard. It was extremely hard. I think a lot of it has become a bit of a block in my brain, where I just kind of just forgotten about it, and that's fine. And that's a coping strategy. It's the fight, flight, or freeze. But there's also fawn and others. I tend to fawn and freeze, and those freezing moments have also freezed various neurological pathways in my brain. I'm very sure, because the memories of moments have completely dissipated. I'm grateful for that. I'm thankful for my brain protecting me. However, the circumstances that I'm in now it's night and day. And anyone who's going through that circumstance, and I was the same, listening to someone in a podcast or in a book or whatever going through this, because you hear about it regularly. It shouldn't happen, you do. And I'm like, oh God, that doesn't impact me. It doesn't affect me. I'm different, because I'm always thinking I'm special and different. I'm not. I was being abused. And it's okay to recognize that actually things need to change and to be scared. But it works out, and it worked out really well.
And hopefully that's the case, as you're saying, that the support falls into place. So for someone that hasn't experienced it, like myself, can sit here and say, well, what are the options? I don't know what's there. Well, I wouldn't, because I've not been down the road. But from someone that has experienced it, you have to make the decision, and then the support comes. And you just have to have trust and faith that the systems, the processes, and the support is there.
Definitely. I was terrified of the potential lack of support at the time. I mean, I wasn't in a safe financial situation. I was still a student at the time, living in a rental property with almost zero in my savings, having it been completely destroyed by my ex's financial manipulation, shall we call it, or stealing. So yeah, I was alone. I was pregnant, then had a baby as a student. What do I do? But it did all work out. There's a bit of research that has to be done. There's a bit of looking around and knowing that, some bits are going to be difficult, but it can be done no matter your circumstances. I wasn't in a happy, fluffy situation. When I got out, it was a grind, but there was a lot of support mechanisms, either in the form of benefits from the government, counselling services that there is a long waiting list for, but they are very much worthwhile doing, and taking advantage of what you can, because it will change and it works out for the better every time.
For a perpetrator that's in the military, can they be punished? Like, could they lose their job? Or
Yes.
like dishonourable discharge or something like that? Is that
Yes.
a thing?
Simple as that, yes, they can.
Okay.
It would go through, obviously, the military police side of things, and potentially over into the civilian police side. I'm not entirely sure of the specific legal pathway, but yes, it has happened, and has happened on multiple occasions that people have lost.
Is there data for that? Is that you're aware of? Is there any numbers?
So this is the annoying thing. I actually sent a Freedom of Information Act request off to the MOD to determine the numbers, and they do have the numbers for the actual perpetrations themselves, and those who've gone to conviction and thus lost their job as a result of domestic violence. Anything other than that, though, is not recorded or kept on file by the MOD. So any allegations, anything that hasn't gone basically higher than the RMP, is disregarded and not included in data.
That's interesting as well, to know that there are consequences for the perpetrators, that they just can't swan on with their military life and career, and meanwhile the partners had their whole world turned upside down.
Absolutely. No, there's consequences for actions, and the military does take domestic violence incredibly seriously. They really do. That's a main point to be made, for sure, that they do take it extremely seriously.
Which, as you say, that's their responsibility, so it's good that they do.
The MOD recently published in February of this year an update to their domestic violence action plan, updated in now to go on to 2026. And there is a lot of plans within that to enhance services and to make victims safer, and to make sure that actually spotting red flags and risky behaviour happens prior to violence being perpetrated. And I think that could aid in the prevalence of domestic violence and violent offences that we're seeing within military spheres. But that is yet to materialise into actual statistical data that is usable in forms of research.
But it's helpful and interesting to know that it's on the agenda, and they're constantly looking at. The important thing is to get the message out there for people that they need to speak up. And as terrifying as that is, it's the only way to stop this from happening, is to speak up. And so what would you say to someone then that feels like they're doing their best, and they're supporting someone that they know is a victim, and they're too scared for them to speak up, because then they feel like that person will just turn on them, cut them off, and then they'll have no one? What would you say to that person? Are they doing the right thing?
So to the person who's supporting the victim?
Yeah. Are they doing the right thing through supporting them but keeping quiet?
So absolutely doing the right things in terms of supporting them. All victims or survivors of domestic violence or abuse definitely need support, because that support is lacking at home. In terms of staying quiet, that is so difficult. It's incredibly circumstantial and context dependent, and it can't be stressed lightly that is something that needs to be determined literally per circumstance,
case by case basis.
Absolutely, because there could be a lot of risk factors for the victim. It could be a lot for even the perpetrator, and even for the person who is actually doing the looking after and supporting in the circumstances. But just know that if you notice or see or suspect that something is going on, you have to be able to do something about it, because staying silent and not helping, even when there's a suspicion, even to just bump into someone and say, can I have a few words at something? That has to happen, because all too frequently that is neglected. And a lot of people can slip under the net in after those instances.
Is there an anonymous way that someone could raise a red flag? Do you know of?
It'd be so good though, wouldn't it? I don't actually know. See, again, that's so context dependent.
It would be helpful. I mean, I worked for children's services for many years in safeguarding, and one of the things that would always come up is that if a neighbour or someone in the community had a suspicion about a child that's been neglected or abused, they would talk themselves out of it, and they'd be like, oh no, I don't want to rock the boat, it's probably nothing,
Yeah, exactly.
and that parent's going to get in an awful lot of trouble if I go around saying things like that, so it's fine, and then they leave it go. And that's when you get some of the most severe child abuse and neglect cases, where it's been overlooked by a number of people that don't want to rock the boat, which is it's a tragedy. It's a really, really tragic situation, and I feel like that's possibly the same with domestic abuse as well. People don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to make things worse. They don't want to interfere.
Absolutely. It's an ironic one, that as well, though, because if you are genuinely concerned for someone's well-being and you were to raise it to someone, or be it welfare or the person themselves, and someone was to come back and say something to you or against you for having done so, the only comeback really to that is, I am just trying to make sure that other people are safe. I'm sorry if I offended you for being a decent human being. Again, context and circumstance, it's everything, isn't it? I would lose my friend 100 times over if I thought there was going to be any harm coming to them, for sure.
Yeah. But it's just having the confidence in, where you see that someone's being controlled, and then to have the confidence to report it and say to that person, well, you were being controlled. I don't think that's okay. That's a tough conversation to have, isn't it? Whereas some people might think, I'm not getting involved in that. And I think that's really sad that people feel like that. But then I feel like there's a lot of people with a lot of issues, and I can also see how someone might think, I've got too much of my own shit going on to be worrying about that as well.
Yeah.
Which is,
yeah, absolutely. But that also kind of feeds into that militarized bubble as well, though, even with the person who's giving support rather than being victimized, because that stoicism, that necessary stoicism, and just being that perfect wife, and that staying quiet, helping with the kids, patriarchal bullshit, that isn't just on the victim survivors, that's also on every spouse. And I think that, in fact, one spouse within the paper actually mentioned that to be insufficiently stoic, so to not live up to these military values, being subordinate, that being second best to the military, is basically you being deemed a failure as a military spouse. And no one wants to be a failure. So you have to live at that kind of stoic, perfect level, whether you're the victim, perpetrator, supporter. It's this very odd dynamic.
Because we all have our duties, don't we, as a military spouse?
So the outcome of your study, hopefully, would be a framework of targeted support for military spouse victims of domestic abuse. That's amazing. And are you concerned at all, given your own experience? Obviously, you escaped, you got out of it, which is amazing and just shows the strength that you have. Are you worried about being triggered at all in these conversations and with this work?
There have been some elements where it has, especially in the reading for the dissertation, that's been more difficult to read about. However, can count myself as a very, very lucky individual to say that I got out and was able to not find strengths, because everyone who gets out of these relationships and anyone who's in them is strong. I have probably put them to the back of my mind and have ignored it and will at some point crumble. It's it might be triggering, but I'm there as a researcher. I am not there as a victim myself, and I will do my utmost to make sure that my victimhood or survivor, in whatever way you look at it, is not brought into the conversation, because it's not about me. It's about them. And I don't want that to detract from their experiences at all. That's where my focus has to kind of stay.
That's incredible. And it's such a selfless thing, because you're taking your experience that you've got and you're using that to drive you forward to help other people, which I think is like a really special and amazing thing to do. And I'm looking forward to seeing the research. So if someone is currently facing domestic abuse, what steps should they take to seek support?
Absolutely. It can feel so isolating and terrifying in those moments, whether you are it doesn't matter what type of victimhood you're experiencing. If you feel you are struggling, please do reach out and get help. I tend to see a pattern of military spouse, reaching out to online communities. However, this can be quite a detriment itself, where advice can be given and there's no safeguarding present. There's nothing that an online forum can do for you. The immediate thing to do is to go to welfare. It might be something you think you don't want to do because of other people have told you it's not going to help. But it would be the best advice to go to welfare. And even if you're just to ask for what would one do in this circumstance, to be given the leaflets and to be given the advice lines and everything that you need, because you do need to back yourself up with some form of safety mechanism. And as much as civilian support services might not be tailored to military communities, they are still going to understand what you are going through as a victim of domestic violence. So you've got options that don't mean that you have to go straight to the police, for example.
Yeah. So I think, putting myself in that position, if it was me, the first thing that I would be worried about is getting him in trouble at work and thinking, if I get him in trouble at work, he's going to kill me. And literally, it's not a joke. Some women are living in that fear.
One of the main parts that has come up in my research is the barriers to help seeking that a recent study in 2022 also looked at, coming out of King's College. And part of that is fear of what would happen to your partner's job, of what's going to happen to you, of your living circumstances, your financial circumstances, everything. When I tell you there is a way out of it, there is a way out of it with you being safe. And the number one priority for all services involved is looking after the victim's safety. If it comes to impacting on someone's job role, I hate to be that person, but if it's getting to that, then you need to be getting out of that relationship. Full stop. I'm going to say to hell with it, really. To hell with the job role.
It's put yourself first.
Yourself first, absolutely. But no matter what, if violence is happening within the household and you feel that your life is at risk, you phone the police.
Yeah.
There's no other way around it. You make sure to phone the police.
What about the victims who talk their way out of it? Like, oh, didn't mean it. It's just because he's stressed or he's going through a hard time, and these kinds of things that people so often do. What would you say to them?
Having to make excuses for someone else's behavior that is impacting you, is that really what you want to be doing with your life? I wouldn't make excuses for anyone's behavior other than my own. So you have to take accountability of your own self in that moment and say, actually, I don't have to excuse this behavior. I need to be doing something about this behavior. And it's all fair and well for me to be sat here as someone who's gotten through it, because I recognize just how bloody difficult it is at the time to get out of it. And it took me a long time. It was about a year it took me to finally make the steps to get out of that relationship. It's not something that can happen overnight in many circumstances.
Sure.
But know that there is a way out of this, and you do not have to make any excuses for your partner or husband or family members abuse, because it is just that, it's abuse, and you do not deserve it.
And then, so the overall message for anyone listening is that they can do this and that they'll be fine in the end, but they won't be fine if they stay there.
Absolutely. And it is very cliche to say that, you know, it'll all work out in the end, but it's cliche for a reason, because it's bloody true.
Okay. And so hopefully the research that you're doing will lead to better support in place to, I guess, as you're saying, it already exists, the education for the personnel around being a perpetrator, but it obviously doesn't go far enough. So there needs to be more done with the military personnel to prevent this from happening, the kind of crossover from military training that then seems to seep into the family life. So there needs to be more work done there, and there's more work and more support for the spouses, I guess. So that's what we need.
Definitely.
And hopefully your research will help with that.
Fingers crossed.